I thought I knew everything about this island, but I guess not. I'm your host Yusuf, and these are 10 scary Alcatraz hidden secrets they don't want you to know about. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video, and stay up to date on our videos. Anyways, let's do the jailhouse rock. Number 10, the military used the prison. In 1850, a presidential order set aside the island for possible use as a United States military reservation. The California gold rush, the resulting boom in the growth of San Francisco, and the need to protect San Francisco Bay led the US Army to build a citadel, or fortress, at the top of the island in the early 1850s. The Army also made plans to install more than 100 cannons on the island, making Alcatraz the most heavily fortified military site on the West Coast. Together with Fort Point and Lime Point, Alcatraz formed a triangle of defense, designed to protect the entrance to the bay. The island was also the site of the first operational lighthouse on the west coast of the United States. By the late 1850s, the first military prisoners were being housed on the island, while the defensive necessity of Alcatraz diminished over time. The island never fired its guns in battle, but you'll see what they do with them later. Its role as a prison would continue for more than 100 years. In 1909, the Army tore down the citadel, leaving its basement level to serve as the foundation for a new military prison. From 1909 through 1911, the military prisoners on Alcatraz built the new prison, which was designated the Pacific Branch, U.S. disciplinary barracks for the U.S. Army. It was this prison building that later became famous as The Rock. The U.S. Army used the island for more than 80 years, from 1850 until 1933, when the island was transferred to the U.S. Department of Justice for use by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The federal government had decided to open a maximum security, minimum privilege penitentiary to deal with the most incorrigible inmates in federal prisons, and to show the law-abiding public that the federal government was serious about stopping the rampant crime of the 1920s and 1930s, otherwise known as the coolest era of crime. Number 9, it was closed by Robert F. Kennedy. In 1963, U.S. Attorney General and second most handsome Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, ordered Alcatraz closed, citing the high expense of its maintenance. In its 29-year run, Alcatraz housed more than 1,500 convicts. In March 1964, a group of CO Indians briefly occupied the island, citing an 1868 treaty with the CO allowing Indians to claim any unoccupied government land. In November 1969, a group of nearly 100 Native American students and activists began a more prolonged occupation of the island, remaining there until they were forced off by federal marshals in June 1971. But we'll get into that a bit later on a different point. In 1972, Alcatraz was opened to the public as part of the newly created Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which is maintained by the National Park Service. More than 1 million tourists visit Alcatraz Island and the former prison annually. Number 8, there were hidden tunnels and ammo underneath the prison. Historians had long suspected that the notorious federal penitentiary had been constructed atop US military fortifications built in the 1800s, which we revealed is true. A study published a while ago in Near Surface Geophysics describes the complex found beneath the prison yard. The now closed jail imprisoned some of the worst criminals in US history. The study of the land, which is now controlled by the National Park Service, was conducted with ground-penetrating radar and terrestrial scans. Beneath the prison's recreation yard, researchers discovered evidence of fully buried structures, ammunition magazines, and tunnels. These remains are so well preserved and so close to the surface. Study author Timothy DeSumet, an archaeologist at Binghamton University, told PBS, "They weren't erased from the island, they're right beneath our feet." BBC Science traveled with the archaeologist team to Alcatraz in 2014 to see firsthand how their research was conducted. Number 7, Alcatraz used to have American Indian prisoners. Now we're getting into it, and this stuff can be a little bit disheartening. Many American Indians were imprisoned at Alcatraz after troubles with the US government during westward expansion in the late 1800s. Some were the Army's own Indian scouts who were convicted of mutiny. The Army sent Powhatan Tom to Alcatraz on June 5, 1873, but he was shot by a guard 2 days later. Bronco and Slalik were arrested for participating in the execution of members of a peace commission during the Modoc conflict in northeastern California. The older members of their group were hanged, but President Ulysses S. Grant spared these 2 young men and sent them to Alcatraz. Bronco passed away of disease on Alcatraz, and Slalik remained 5 years, then joined the remaining members of his tribe exiled in Indian Territory. Katina, a Chiricahua Apache chief who was a compatriot of Geronimo, was imprisoned for 2 years on Alcatraz. Upon his release, the army said his stay at Alcatraz has worked a complete reformation in his character. In January 1895, 19 Hopis were sent from northern Arizona to the Alcatraz prison. These Hopi village leaders were involved in land disputes with the government, and they refused to comply with a mandatory government education program for their children. Besides sawing large logs on Alcatraz, some of the Hopi were given tours of San Francisco public schools so that they can see the harmlessness of the multiplication table, according to a San Francisco newspaper. The Hopi were released after they pledged to cease interference with the plans of the government for the civilization and education of its Indian wards, although they continued their resistance to government policies after returning to Arizona. Number 6, there was an outbreak at the prison, and not zombies, sorry guys. During the Spanish-American War, thousands of troops going to and from the Philippines passed through San Francisco. Many soldiers returned with contagious tropical diseases, and all local hospitals, including Alcatraz, were filled with convalescing patients. Many other soldiers returned as prisoners, and Alcatraz was quickly overwhelmed. Between 1899 and 1900, the prison population grew from just 25 to 441. Another prison complex was hastily built on the Alcatraz parade ground in early 1900. Upper prison consisted of 3 wooden cell houses with 2 tiers each, surrounded by a stockade fence. As additional support buildings were added to the complex, lower prison was converted into a workspace for prisoners. Both lower and upper prison were fire traps. An oil lantern fire almost destroyed lower prison in 1902, and prisoner/arsonist George Firebug Bender wanted to burn down upper prison. During the 1906 earthquake and fire chaos in San Francisco, a firestorm approached the city jail. Officials evacuated 176 city prisoners to Alcatraz for 9 days. Alcatraz needed new fire-resistant buildings. Number 5, and I bet you didn't know this, the name was changed in 1915. The army soon realized that this huge prison complex did not portray an image of military obedience and loyalty. In 1915, the island was renamed the Pacific Branch U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, and new emphasis was put on education and rehabilitation. The prisoners attended military training, remedial education, and vocational training. Many were restored to full duty after their sentence was served, although some were issued a dishonorable discharge. Public disapproval of the Army's prison resulted in new landscaping projects on the island. Some prisoners were trained as gardeners and planted lawns of clover and bluegrass, as well as roses, sweet peas, and lilies on the eastern side of the island. In 1924, the California Spring Blossom and Wildflower Association contributed 100 pounds of nasturtium and poppy seeds and 300 trees and shrubs to beautify Alcatraz Island. As a disciplinary barracks, Alcatraz was a minimum security institution. Most prisoners were locked in their cells only at night and spent their days going to work, classes, and recreation. Work assignments varied according to how responsible the prisoners were. Some prisoners were house servants and babysitters for the army officers' families. Others crushed rock in the quarry on Alcatraz. Punishment for disobedience meant being locked in prison's solitary confinement cells or being chained to iron rings in the citadel below. Number 4, in 1863, the army accidentally shot at a friendly ship while stationed at Alcatraz. In October 1863, an unidentified armed ship entered San Francisco Bay. Because there was no wind, the flag hung limp and men in rowboats towed the ship. The ship did not head toward the San Francisco docks. Instead, it traveled toward Angel Island to the North Bay, toward the Army Arsenal and the Navy shipyard. The commanding officer at Alcatraz had a duty to ensure that no hostile foreign warship entered the bay. Captain William Winder ordered the Alcatraz artillery to fire a blank charge as a signal for the ship to stop. The rowboats continued pulling the ship. Winder then ordered his men to fire an empty shell towards the bow of the ship, a challenge to submit to the local authority, which Winder confirmed was a 21-gun salute. Through the smoke, the Alcatraz troops could finally see the British flag waving on the HMS Sutlej, flagship of Admiral John Kingham. Alcatraz responded with a return salute. Soon messages were exchanged rather than gunfire. As Commander-in-Chief of the British Navy in the Pacific, Kingham wrote that he was displeased at his reception in San Francisco. But I mean, nothing's more American than that. Captain Winder explained his actions by saying, "The ship's direction was so unusual, I deemed it my duty to bring her to and ascertain her character." The US commander of the Department of the Pacific supported Winder and replied that King Cum had ignored the established procedures for entering a foreign port during war. Winder later received a letter of gentle reminder to act cautiously. Some San Franciscans thought Winder may have saved the day, considering that Great Britain favored the Confederacy. Number 3. Birdman. The island's most famous prisoner was probably Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz, who spent 54 years of his life behind bars. Stroud never had any birds at Alcatraz, nor was he the grandfatherly person portrayed by Burt Lancaster in the well-known movie. In 1909, Stroud was convicted of manslaughter. While serving his prison sentence at the U.S. Penitentiary, USP, McNeil Island, Washington, he viciously attacked another inmate. This resulted in his transfer to USP Leavenworth, Kansas. In 1916, he ended a Leavenworth guard, was convicted of first-degree slaughter, and received an execution sentence. His mother pleaded for his life, and in 1920, President Woodrow Wilson commuted the execution sentence to life imprisonment. It was Stroud's violent behavior that earned him time in segregation. During the 30 years at Leavenworth, he developed his interest in birds and eventually wrote 2 books about canaries and their diseases. Initially, prison officials allowed Stroud's bird studies because it was seen as a constructive use of his time. However, contraband items were often found in the bird cages, and prison officials discovered that equipment Stroud had requested for his scientific studies had actually been used to construct a still for homebrew. Stroud was transferred to Alcatraz in 1942, where he spent the next 17 years, 6 years in segregation in D Block and 11 years in the prison hospital. In 1959, he was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where he passed away on November 21, 1963. Number 2. No one was confirmed to escape. Over 29 years, 1934 to 1963, that the federal prison operated, 36 men, including 2 who tried to escape twice, were involved in 14 separate escape attempts. Of these, 23 were caught, 6 were shot and ended during their escape, and 2 drowned. 2 of the men who were caught were later executed in the gas chamber at the California State Prison at San Quentin for their role in the passing of a correctional officer during the famous May 2-4, 1946 Battle of Alcatraz escape attempt. Whether or not anyone succeeded in escaping from Alcatraz depends on the definition of successful escape. Is it getting out of the cell house, reaching the water, making it to land, or reaching land and not getting caught? Officially, no one ever succeeded in escaping from Alcatraz, although to this day there are 5 prisoners listed as missing and presumed drowned. One of the many myths about Alcatraz is that it was impossible to survive a swim from the island to the mainland because of sharks. In fact, there are no man-eating sharks in San Francisco Bay, only small bottom-feeding ones. The main obstacles were the cold temperature, averaging 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the strong currents, and the distance to shore, at least 1 to a quarter miles. Prior to the federal institution opening in 1934, a teenage girl swam to the island to prove it was possible. Fitness guru Jack LaLanne once swam to the island pulling a rowboat, and several years ago, 2 10-year-old children also made the swim. If a person is well trained and conditioned, it is possible to survive the cold waters and fast currents. Number 1, not everyone there was famous. While several well-known criminals such as Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, the first Public Enemy #1, and Arthur Doc Barker did time on Alcatraz, most of the prisoners incarcerated there were not well-known gangsters, but prisoners who refused to conform to the rules and regulations at other federal institutions, who were considered violent and dangerous, or who were considered escape risks. The average population was only about 260 to 275. The prison never reached its capacity of 336. At any given time, Alcatraz held less than 1% of the total federal prison population. Many prisoners actually consider the living conditions, for instance always 1 man to a cell, at Alcatraz to be better than other federal prisons, and several inmates actually requested a transfer to Alcatraz. But while USP Alcatraz was not the America's Devil Island that books and movies often portrayed, it was designed to be a prison system's prison. If a man did not behave at other institutions, he could be sent to Alcatraz, where the highly structured, monotonous daily routine was designed to teach an inmate to follow rules and regulations. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and comment if you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you next time on Crime Time.